Hello, class. It's Miss Roberts here, and today we're going to go over the organizational decision-making chapter. Let's begin. So I hope everyone's doing well. This chapter is very interesting because we've reviewed the following different types of organizational communication traditions, and with that, it explores like how these traditions and how the transformation of these traditions kind of evolved with the theories. So we're going to talk about how the rational decision-making process is hampered by individual and organizational limits. And we're going to learn about the alternative ways that individuals and groups make decisions. Then we're going to describe the phase models of group decision making and then become familiar with the concept of groupthink. We might have heard of groupthink before, and we're going to talk about how it impacts organizational communication and how can we deal or help avoid groupthink. We're also going to talk about how to compare and contrast effective and cognitive models of participative decision making, be familiar with the ways that participation has been instituted in organizations, appreciate the ways of collaboration in decision making, and understanding knowledge management systems. All right, let me move myself real quick. All right. So when we think about traditional models of decision making is very formulaic, right? Just like with classical management styles, when we think about the normative model of decision making, we talk about the problem, then with formulation, we develop different ways to solve the problem, brainstorm methods to solve the problem. Then we have details of how to execute the decision, evaluate if those decisions that we make work, and implement, and especially like make permanent decisions within the organization. All right. But of course, like similar to classical management models, it's very formulaic and people are people. So we had to account for people not being rational all the time, organizations which is made up of people not being rational all the time, dealing with irrational outside systems, dealing with maybe irrational customers. How do we mold and adapt to different ways of solving problems? So with the optimizing model, the decision makers attempt to find a single best solution for an organizational problem. So maybe if the problem is simple, or maybe if that single solution solves the problem, that's fine. But sometimes it doesn't work out that way. So now we want to make sure that with intuitive decision making is based on past experiences in similar contexts. So like the name suggests, we are able to be flexible with not only the traditional knowledge that we can get from the rational model, but where has our experience gone? How about customer or outside feedback? What are the changes that are happening in technology or in the way that society functions that makes more rigid decision making models less valuable? So with intuitive decision making, we're using, in addition to our regular methods of decision making, we are using past experience and similar contexts. So one way we can do this is with the phase decision making model. So this happens in four phases. I also teach small group communication, so it's very similar to how group formation comes about. So we have orientation. So group members become acquainted with each other, and we're evaluating strengths and weaknesses and figuring out, okay, which group member or which group of group members can help tackle on the problem. And in this case, conflict necessarily doesn't mean fighting, but we're evaluating and going through different solutions that can be presented and debated. So conflict isn't necessarily an argument, but there's debate on how to best go or best approach a problem. With the emergence part of the phase, the consensus is reached, which is of course possible by the brainstorming and debates of the conflict. And then we have reinforcement. The decision is supported and reinforced throughout the organization. With the multiple sequence model, this represents a variety of decision paths taken by groups. So unlike our previous model, we're trying to be flexible. We're trying to figure out how do we solve the problem? What kind of strengths do people bring to solve the problems? So when doing that research, more often times than not, they do the complex cyclic pathway of decision making. So sometimes it's not a one and done type of situation. Sometimes new issues may arise, new information may arise. Think of technology as more of a disruptive piece of technology. So where many organizations, including education, is trying to figure out how to navigate this new path. So the things that might have worked before might not work today. So we have to cycle through problem solving solutions and discussions and implementation and research to make sure that we are catching up to the problems that might be outside the system, but also making sure that our internal organization is ready for the challenges. And if we don't, excuse me, if we're not constantly communicating and adjusting, we might fall behind. Let's see. So the unitary sequence path is pretty much the general problem, find the problem, find the solution, and reinforce, which is fine, especially for smaller problems or problems that actually have a solution. Then we have solution-oriented path where they don't necessarily go through the process or analysis, but they just go and try to find a solution. All right. So next we have groupthink. So because we're in communication majors, and you might have heard this in other classes as well, maybe sociology, maybe psychology, remember that communication studies is a mix of many different types of subjects. So when you think of groupthink, that's when group members are striving for unanimity and it overrides the motivation to praise alternative courses of action. And we might have done this before where it might be too much of a risk to speak up. It might be too much of inconvenience to speak up, and it's just easier to go with the group. But this does have consequences because the group might not have the best solution, but people who dissent might. Or if you come from an organizational culture where coming with ideas or going against the grain is looked down upon, then there's additional pressure not to speak up, which contributes to groupthink. And in a couple of slides, we're also going to talk about the paradoxes of fighting this, excuse me, of fighting groupthink, because companies might say, hey, we want new ideas, but there are certain ways to go about it, especially in corporate. So we'll talk about that in a minute. But here's the functional theory and how we can use the correct group decision making or adjust and optimize group decision making, because group decision making isn't bad. We want to make sure to have all different types of knowledge, experiences, cultural backgrounds, and that makes us stronger. So that is the strength of group communication, is that we have a lot of people. But it's a little bit more complex. We have different ideas. We might have dissent and conflict within the group. So here's some ways to curb some of the negative parts of small group thinking and make it more efficient. So we can have a correct understanding of the issue because we have so many people involved. And as it's almost like a game of telephone where you might say one thing to one person, but they interpreted something different. So we have to make sure that we're on the same page of what's going on. Determine minimal characteristics. So just making sure we know the most important parts of the problem, the most important parts of the situation, and identify relevant alternatives. So we're also combating that paradox of choice, because the more moving parts, the more information, the more confusion that can happen. So if someone dissents, it might not be someone's putting them down, not putting them down, rather, knocking down the idea because of not wanting to hear it, but there might be a miscommunication of the details. Simple as that. Examine alternatives and selecting the best alternative. So similar to the traditional forms of group decision making, but we're just making sure to double check if everybody's on the same page, giving them room to dissent or bring relevant alternatives and examine those alternatives, but not bombard the group with so much information to where we go back to groupthink, and making it easier for us to be like, okay, whatever, do what you want, just because it's a little bit difficult. All right. So what are the symptoms of groupthink? There are different ways that groupthink can show up. For example, the illusion of invulnerability. We have a tendency to say, oh, if everybody's doing it, then it must be good. But that's a fallacy. You want to make sure to examine what the group is doing and say, okay, well, I will go along with it because I think it's the right thing to do, not solely because the group is doing this. Then there's an illusion of morality. Self-righteous belief that the virtues of the group are above reproach. This is a little bit more insidious, because just because the group says it, or think about in a corporate setting, right? You are the top of a major company. We went over in our company organizational profiles. We have these companies that we want to work for. So if we have these big top companies that we want to work for and we're in the room, we might think like, oh, because I work for Disney, I can't say, oh, this is wrong. Or, oh, because I work for Netflix, oh, this is wrong. So by the illusion of morality, the virtues of the group are above reproach because of who they are. And that's just not true. Then we have stereotyping, characterizing others outside of the group in ways that cast their perspectives as unacceptable. So we definitely don't want to do that. Not just because it's the right thing to do to not stereotype. We want to make sure that everyone's voices are heard. And if they're outside the group, they might bring a new perspective that can help your organization. And then it might just be ourselves with self-censorship. So it's the overt restraint of group members against offering opinions to counter the prevailing thought of the group. So we might want to have a different opinion, but we might be like, oh, well, I'm not good enough, or I'm not high enough in the total poll to have an opinion, or I'm afraid of the consequences for my job. There's many reasons why we self-censor, but that does contribute to groupthink. The illusion of unanimity. So this is a statement of a group of agreement in private, while private doubts and disagreements are suppressed. And we might have gone through this before. Think about a place where you went to work, and say if you work at a restaurant, or say if you work at a small business or any other business, you have the group meeting, and you either there's a new decision that's coming down, and we say, yeah, we agree, this is great, in front of the higher ups, but in private or with your colleagues, there's discussions like, oh, this doesn't make sense, but the people who are decision makers are in charge, they don't know that doesn't make sense. So there's an illusion that everybody's on board, but no one is speaking up to say, hey, this course of action doesn't make sense, or hey, this doesn't work in a more practical sense. So there's that. Then there's direct pressure on descendants. So there's the coercive force that obligates, that obliges the group members to behave and think in similar ways. So this is it's a little bit more insidious, right? Because there's no open space for someone to have a dissenting opinion, and it is, excuse me, it is looked down upon to dissent to a decision. And then reliance on self appointed mind guards, so protection of the group from countering information from outside forces. So sometimes we might have people within the group that apply pressure on the group itself and kind of protects it from outside information, outside forces. So think about an organization, I don't want to say called, but think about an organization or a group where there's there is pressure for the group to be unanimous. Maybe they're trying to save time, maybe have they're probably higher up in the food chain as far as people who are making the decisions. For whatever reason, you have people within the group, almost like the opposite of self-censorship. You have people on the inside of the group that are policing and making sure, like, hey, everybody should be on board. And that might contribute to groupthink. All right, so next, let's talk about how participation and decision making can improve productivity and satisfaction. So, when we think about participation, we can think of or look at two models, the affective model and cognitive model. The affective model seeks to satisfy employees' higher order needs to increase job satisfaction. This can include promotions, rewards, or awards, excuse me, making sure that they feel pride on the job. And then we have the cognitive model. So it seeks to improve the upward and downward flow of information because with this mentality, better informed workers have better information. So as long as everybody's in the loop, everybody performs better. So here's a little diagram of the affective model. So we have the satisfaction of satisfaction of higher order needs, work satisfaction, which increases motivation, which increases productivity. With the counter model, we have upward and downward flow of information. And because everyone's better informed and can use information to make better decisions, that in and of itself increases productivity, and that increased productivity then increases satisfaction versus before the satisfaction came before productivity. All right. All right. So workplace democracy is the way that this participative model or idea is manifested. So it has the idea that workers are still entitled to free speech and dignity. And we can see from chapter 1 and chapter 2 when we talked about the early models of organization communication were reflective of those earlier times where workers were viewed as machines and they were treated as such. But as time went on, as we evolved, we're introduced to hierarchy of needs when we are introduced to diversity within organizations. And when we pay attention to the human side of human resources, that's where this participant ideal came about. So, yeah, excuse me, different types of participation. So we have consultative or participative actions that encourage employees to work within an organization instead of just having top-down decision making, and then having, say, in working conditions, company policy and hiring, and a locus of participation. So is it departmental or organizational? In what ways do people participate and make decisions? And to what extent do they have the freedom to do so? All right. However, like I mentioned before, with this type of participative democracy, there are certain paradoxes, and we might have encountered this, especially working in corporate or maybe working for a non-profit organization. We're balancing the needs of the company, and the company has to survive, right? with the needs of the employees, no matter which level within an organization. So we have structural paradoxes where organizational democracy is planned, designed, and formalized. But because we have to have these formal systems, especially with large organizations, but employees are told that be spontaneous and vocal and be assertive. But sometimes being assertive and being creative might either be stifled or there might be a backlash. And then it can lead to confusion, right? And then we have agency. So organizations want their employees to have agency, sense of responsibility and autonomy, not to feel micromanaged, and cooperate within the participative system. But still, if you go too outside the box or go beyond what your work title and dictates, do things our way, but in a way that's distinctly our own. So I don't know if you've ever been in a situation at work where you tried a different system, tried to do something differently, and then you got in trouble. But your idea might have worked better, but because it didn't follow by the book, you never know. So it might be that paradox of agency you've been experiencing. And then we have identity. So there's paradoxes concerning issues of inclusion, boundaries, and interests within the participative system. So what employees are told, be self-managing to reach organizational goals. So uh, let's think about the idea of work-life balance, right? And we're having a larger conversations about work-life balance and how we need to have lives outside of the organization. But not too much. Don't take too much PTO. Don't have too many problems outside of the work because those interests in yourself and your self care might conflict with organizational goals, and the organization has to survive. See where we're going here? Then finally, power. There's paradoxes concerning how control and leadership are exercised within a participatory system. Be independent, just like I commanded you. So when we think about hierarchy in organizations, sometimes we might have these big, bold ideas, or hmm, we might want to participate and present our new ideas to the higher ups, but the higher ups do have the power to say yay to the idea or nay to the idea. So, or especially if the idea kind of makes you look good or makes the people in power look bad. So, in those instances, it's the paradox of be independent, just like I commanded you. So you can be great, but not too great. All right. So the collaboration process, multinational companies and non-governmental organizations deal with global issues and technology issues. With technology, we're able to meet and talk and make decisions together, but we still have many things to contend with. Political, excuse me, political ideologies. We have structural ideologies, cult, different cultures and how they deal with problems and issues. So intercultural conflicts that can happen. So this can involve tensions that cause the organizations to struggle in making decisions. But boundary objects help. So the book talks about how a PowerPoint slide helped everybody to be on the same page. And it's a more of a neutral way versus talking. So like, hey, here are the slides, here's the information, and then everybody was able to make and interpret the information in the same way. So sometimes having those boundary objects or those neutral objects that kind of take not the culture, but tend to take some of the differences out and streamlines the information can help mediate these differences. Then we have different types of organizational knowledge that can be shared and used. So we have synoptic knowledge, which is your regular structural manuals and expert systems and expert people that tells us what to do. It has that historical knowledge that's carried on. But then we have cultural knowledge. It is the understanding of the systems and acting organized and coordinated way. So this is our company culture, our motto, our vision. This is how people operate within an organization day by day. Then we have improvisational knowledge. So what is the knowledge, the combination of that synoptic and cultural knowledge that we use in every day, and how can we use that knowledge to base or to understand or make decisions within unusual situations. So, for example, think of the pandemic as the most unusual situation that affected all of us. And when that happened, as an instructor, I'll just use myself as an example, where your instructors had to learn how to teach online overnight. Some of us had the knowledge, some of us didn't. So we had to kind of streamline or improvise during that time because it was such an unusual situation. Now online education is more commonplace, but back then it wasn't. So with that improvisational knowledge, sometimes you can find innovation through that, or not necessarily a crisis, but just a way where you're forced to think outside the box. That's when you can share that newfound knowledge so it can turn into synoptic and cultural knowledge. All right. So finally, we have approaches to decision-making processes. I know I'm behind the title here. So we have the different approaches: classical, human relations, human resources, systems, cultural, constructive, critical, and feminist. So with classical decision making and what would be considered, decision making is a rational, logical process that emphasizes procedures. But human relations talks about the avenues for satisfaction of workers and needs. Satisfied workers are more productive. With human relations, participation is an avenue for eliciting valuable information and ensuring effective implementation of organizational decisions. Systems is making a complex process involving varied stages, both informational and organizational, in order to take to be a part of this knowledge and management systems. So remember system theory, bunch of parts, and then part of the systems is making those decisions and what comes from those decisions. Cultural decision making reflects organizational values and assumptions, and it's an important facet of embedded knowledge. So we just talked about the different types of knowledge we can draw from. We have the information from the actual manuals, the actual information that's written down, but then what is the company culture and how does it manifest as, or how does the actions and the behaviors of the organization manifest in everyday life? Constitutive, so that's when decision making is interactive through the organization. Text created through conversation can facilitate or impede collaborative process. So the communication itself helps decision making, and we want to make sure that it's open and effective communication within the members in the organization. Then we have critical. So we talked about how management can exert control over employees through the definition and acceptance of decision premises and processes. So especially with large organizations or organizations with a hierarchy, all those doesn't happen in a vacuum. And you have to think about who has the authority to make decisions, who has the authority to come up with solutions. Will those solutions be implemented, regardless if they're effective or not? Will you have pushback by people in power? And are people in power incentivized to not have innovative decision making? And then finally, the feminist approach. So there's decision making to enact feminist values as a non-hierarchical structure, regard for emotion, and supportive interaction. So uh, how can we add those feminine values into the organizational processes? All right, so we talked about how the rational decision making can be hampered by individual or organizational limits. Be careful about groupthink and be familiar with it and how to combat groupthink, how to contrast effective and kind of methods of decision making. We talked about how we should be aware of benefits and challenges of organizational democracy, which decision making is critical for global and interorganizational relationships, and understanding knowledge management systems. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining me. Let me know if you have any questions, and I will see you soon. Thank you so much, everyone. Bye.